They said she was too emotional, too soft for real combat operations. But when 4 enemy rounds tore through Evelyn Jones's body in the Afghan desert, she didn't collapse. She grabbed 2 wounded Navy SEALs and carried them 3 miles through hostile territory while coordinating artillery strikes on her radio. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, make sure to subscribe, as I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. What happened that sunny morning would force an entire military base to question everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and what it really means to be a warrior. The morning briefing at Forward Operating Base Sentinel began early, but Evelyn Jones had been awake for hours. She stood near the communications tent, watching the sun paint the Afghan mountains gold, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had grown cold. At 23, Evelyn was an anomaly at the base. Born in Manchester, England, she had enlisted in the U.S. Army after moving to America with her family at 16. Her accent still carried traces of her European roots, and her emotional responses to the harsh realities of war had earned her a reputation she couldn't shake. The other soldiers called her tears behind her back, not with cruelty, but with the kind of dismissive affection reserved for someone they considered too sensitive for the real work of war. Evelyn stood barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighed 125 pounds. But what really set her apart wasn't her size. It was her tendency to wear her heart on her sleeve. When civilian casualties were reported, her eyes would well up. When fellow soldiers were injured, she'd openly show concern in ways that made the hardened veterans uncomfortable. In a culture that prized emotional control above all else, Evelyn's authentic reactions marked her as someone who couldn't handle the pressure when it really mattered. The irony was that she was one of the most technically proficient soldiers on the base. Her marksmanship scores consistently ranked in the top 5%. Her knowledge of artillery coordination was encyclopedic. She could calculate firing solutions in her head faster than most soldiers could with computers. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had an intuitive understanding of Afghan terrain that came from months of studying local geography and culture. But none of that seemed to matter when mission assignments were handed out. The briefing tent buzzed with pre-dawn energy as she slipped inside. Maps covered every surface. Red zones marking Taliban strongholds, blue lines indicating patrol routes. Major Derek Harrison stood at the front, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled teams. Evelyn found her usual spot near the communications equipment, her notebook ready, though she already suspected what role she'd be assigned. "Today's reconnaissance mission is codenamed Desert Wind," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in special operations. "We've got intelligence indicating high-value targets in Sector 12. This is a joint operation with SEAL Team 7. I need absolute precision and complete situational awareness." Evelyn's pen hovered over her notepad as Harrison began reading assignments. "Rodriguez, your lead reconnaissance. Thompson, you're handling Overwatch. Williams, you're on point communications." The names continued, each one representing months of training together, shared experiences under fire, proven competence in combat situations. But when it came to Evelyn, Harrison's tone shifted slightly. "Jones, you're managing base communications coordination. Monitor all radio traffic and maintain situation reports for command. Base communications." Again. Evelyn nodded professionally, her expression neutral, despite the familiar sting of disappointment. Around her, the selected team members exchanged confident grins and tactical discussions. She might as well have been invisible. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach tighten. "Honestly, I'm glad Jones isn't coming with us," she heard Sergeant Martinez whisper to his partner. "Last thing we need in a firefight is someone breaking down when things get intense." "She's solid with the technical stuff," Rodriguez replied. "But combat's different. When bullets start flying, you need people who can compartmentalize. She feels everything too much." Evelyn pretended to organize her notes, but the words cut deep. She'd heard variations of this assessment countless times. Too emotional, too reactive, too likely to crack under real pressure. It didn't matter that she had never actually failed in a crisis situation. The assumption was that her emotional responses would eventually become a liability. The most frustrating part was that she understood their reasoning, even if she disagreed with it. In life or death situations, emotional control was crucial. But what they failed to understand was that her emotional investment wasn't a weakness. It was what drove her to be better prepared, more knowledgeable, more committed to bringing everyone home safely. That afternoon, while the reconnaissance team prepared for their mission, Evelyn threw herself into studying Sector 12. She memorized every elevation marker, every potential cover position, every historical pattern of Taliban movement in the area. She updated her knowledge of artillery positions and reviewed communication protocols until she could execute them in her sleep. Nobody had asked her to do this additional preparation. Nobody expected it. But Evelyn had learned that being ready for opportunity or crisis was the only way to prove that emotional investment could be a strength rather than a weakness. The team departed in the early afternoon, their vehicles disappearing into the shimmering heat of the Afghan desert. Evelyn watched from the communication center until they were just dust clouds on the horizon, then settled in for what she expected would be a routine day of monitoring radio chatter and filing reports. She had no way of knowing that by sunset, everything would change, that the sunny afternoon would transform into the most intense combat situation of her military career, that her emotional investment, her obsessive preparation, and her refusal to accept limitations would become the difference between life and death for two Navy SEALs whose names she didn't even know yet. The first indication of trouble came through the radio in the form of urgent, clipped voices that made Evelyn's blood run cold. She was updating communication logs when Rodriguez's voice cut through the static, tight with controlled panic. "Base, this is Desert Wind. We are taking heavy fire. Repeat, we are under attack in the Sector 12 Alpha." Evelyn dropped her pen and leaned into the radio console, her hands automatically moving to adjust frequencies and boost signal strength. Around the communication center, other personnel stopped their activities and turned toward the speakers. "Desert Wind, this is Base. What's your situation?" Major Harrison's voice responded from the command center next door. "Multiple hostiles, estimated 15 to 20 Taliban fighters," Rodriguez replied. "They were waiting for us, sir. This was an ambush. We've got 2 men down, 1 critical, requesting immediate extraction and close air support." Evelyn's hands moved across the communication board without conscious thought, switching to encrypted channels and establishing backup communication links. Her emotional response to crisis, the same trait that made others doubt her combat readiness, now translated into hypervigilant focus. Every sound, every pause in transmission, every change in vocal tone registered in her consciousness. "Desert Wind, extraction team is 20 minutes out. Can you hold position?" Harrison asked. There was a pause filled with gunfire before Rodriguez responded. "Negative, sir. Position is compromised. We're moving to secondary extraction point, but we've got wounded who can't move fast. We need artillery support to clear our 6. Evelyn was already calculating firing solutions before anyone asked. She had memorized the terrain of Sector 12, knew exactly where the secondary extraction point was located, and could visualize the likely Taliban positions based on the sound patterns coming through the radio. Her fingers flew across the communication console, pulling up artillery coordination channels. "Rodriguez," she said into her headset, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "This is base communications. What's your exact grid reference?" "Who is this?" Rodriguez's voice came back, confused by the unfamiliar protocol. "This is Jones. I need your precise location for artillery coordination." "What's your grid reference?" There was another pause filled with the sound of sustained gunfire. Then Rodriguez's voice returned, professional despite the circumstances. "Grid reference 41 RQ1 2345 67890. "I've got it," Evelyn interrupted, her hands already inputting coordinates into the fire direction system. She could hear Major Harrison in the background, probably trying to locate the official artillery coordinator, but there wasn't time for proper protocol. The next transmission from Rodriguez made everyone in the communication center freeze. "Base, we've got a bigger problem. SEAL Team 7 is also in Sector 12 and they're not responding to radio calls. Last known position was Grid 41 RQ1 56789 Evelyn felt ice form in her stomach. The SEALs were operating independently, but they were less than 2 miles from the ambush site. If they had been compromised, there were now potentially 4 special operations soldiers in immediate danger. "Desert Wind, maintain your movement to secondary extraction. I'm trying to raise SEAL Team 7, Harrison ordered. For the next few minutes, Evelyn listened to increasingly desperate attempts to contact the SEALs while simultaneously coordinating artillery support for Rodriguez's team. She could hear the stress building in Rodriguez's voice as his team moved through hostile territory with wounded soldiers, and she could sense Harrison's growing concern about the missing SEALs. Then a transmission came through that changed everything. Any station? Any station. This is SEAL Team 7. We are down to 2 effectives with multiple wounded. Request immediate assistance. Grid reference 41, RQ1 45678 The voice was weak, barely audible through static and background noise. Evelyn quickly triangulated the position. The SEALs were pinned down in a ravine approximately 3 miles from the nearest friendly forces, with no clear extraction route. SEAL Team 7, this is base, Harrison responded immediately. What's your status? 2 KIA, 2 critical wounded, 2 walking wounded, came the reply. We're surrounded and taking heavy fire from elevated positions. We can't move the critical casualties without assistance. Evelyn stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through possibilities. The extraction team was already committed to Rodriguez's position. Helicopter support was 20 minutes away, but the SEALs might not have 20 minutes. Artillery couldn't fire danger close to their position without risking friendly fire casualties. Someone needed to reach the SEALs physically, provide immediate medical assistance, and help coordinate their extraction. Someone who could navigate the terrain, fight their way through hostile territory, and maintain communication with both the SEALs and base command. As these thoughts crystallized in her mind, Evelyn realized that everyone in the communications center was looking at her. They had all reached the same conclusion, but none of them wanted to voice it. The SEALs needed help that only she was positioned to provide. But getting to them would mean leaving her assigned post, disobeying orders, and putting herself in the most dangerous combat situation the base had faced in months. Evelyn looked at the radio console, then at the tactical map showing 2 separate teams of American soldiers fighting for their lives in the Afghan desert. Her emotional investment in their survival, the same trait that made others question her combat readiness, now crystallized into absolute clarity. She stood up and began gathering her gear. "Jones, what are you doing?" Sergeant Williams asked, as Evelyn began strapping on her tactical vest and checking her weapon systems. "I'm going to get them," she replied simply, her voice carrying a calm determination that surprised everyone in the room. "You can't just leave your post," Williams protested. "You're not authorized for field operations, and Major Harrison specifically assigned you to communications coordination." Evelyn paused in her preparations and looked directly at Williams. "Sergeant, those SEALs have maybe 15 minutes before they're overrun. The extraction team is committed elsewhere. Air support is 20 minutes out, and artillery can't fire danger close without killing them. Someone has to reach them now." "That someone isn't you," Williams shot back. "You're communications, not infantry. You've never been in actual combat." The words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt. Evelyn had trained extensively, had proven herself in every simulation and exercise, but she had never faced live enemy fire. Her emotional responses had always kept her away from the sharp end of military operations. But as she listened to the increasingly desperate radio calls from the pinned-down SEALs, those same emotions that others saw as weakness crystallized into unshakable resolve. "I know the terrain better than anyone else on this base," she said, shouldering her pack. "I've memorized every route, every elevation, every piece of cover between here and their position. I can navigate there in 30 minutes. "Jones, this is insane," another communications specialist interjected. "Even if you could reach them, what then? You can't carry 2 wounded SEALs by yourself." Evelyn finished her equipment check and turned toward the exit. "Then I guess I'll figure it out when I get there." As she reached the door, Williams called out one more time. "What do I tell Major Harrison when he asks where you've gone?" Evelyn paused without turning around. "Tell him I went to bring our people home." The route to the SEAL's position took her through terrain that looked deceptively peaceful under the afternoon sun. Rolling hills covered in sparse vegetation, scattered rock outcroppings that provided natural cover, and the occasional dried riverbed that carved serpentine paths through the landscape. It was the kind of scenery that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but Evelyn knew that beauty was deceptive. Every hill could hide enemy fighters, Every rock formation could conceal an ambush, and every step took her deeper into territory where Taliban forces had been operating for years. She moved carefully but quickly, using the navigation skills she had developed through months of studying the local geography. Her emotional investment in understanding this environment, previously dismissed as excessive preparation, now guided her through the safest routes toward the embattled SEALs. She heard the first sounds of combat ahead, the distinctive crack of M4 carbines mixed with the heavier reports of AK-47s and the occasional boom of RPG explosions. The SEALs were still fighting, which meant they were still alive. Evelyn keyed her priorities, keeping her voice low. SEAL Team 7, this is base communications. I'm approximately 1 click from your position, approaching from the southeast. What's your tactical situation? The response came immediately, tight with pain and exhaustion. Base communications. This is Chief Petty Officer Marcus Chen. We're in a ravine with steep walls on 3 sides. Enemy has high ground advantage, and we're running low on ammunition. 2 of my men need immediate medical attention. Copy that, Chief, Evelyn replied. I'm carrying medical supplies and can provide artillery coordination. Hold your position. I'm coming to you. There was a pause before Chen's voice returned, confusion evident despite the combat stress. Base communications, did you say you're approaching our position? Are you part of the extraction team? Evelyn smiled grimly as she navigated around a cluster of rocks that would have been invisible on satellite imagery, but were clearly marked in her mental map of the terrain. Negative, Chief? I'm just someone who refuses to let good people die on a sunny day. The last 500 meters to the SEAL's position proved to be the most challenging. The terrain became increasingly broken, with steep slopes and narrow passages that channeled movement into predictable routes. Evelyn could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing, punctuated by shouts in Pashto that indicated the Taliban fighters were coordinating their assault. She crested a small ridge and saw the tactical situation spread out below her like a deadly diorama. The SEALs were positioned in a narrow ravine, using scattered rocks and a destroyed vehicle for cover. On the surrounding high ground, muzzle flashes marked the positions of at least 12 enemy fighters who had the Americans completely surrounded. 2 of the SEALs were clearly wounded, lying motionless behind cover while their teammates returned fire with decreasing frequency, a sure sign of ammunition running low. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional rescue would require overwhelming force that wasn't available. But Evelyn hadn't come this far to attempt a conventional rescue. As she studied the enemy positions and calculated firing solutions for artillery support, she realized that her emotional investment in saving these men had led her to a moment that would define not just her military career, but her understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. She keyed her radio one more time. Chief Chen, this is your backup. I'm in position to provide fire support and medical assistance. Get ready to move your wounded. We're going home today. Evelyn positioned herself on the ridge overlooking the ravine, her heart pounding as she assessed the tactical situation. Below her, she could see Chief Petty Officer Chen and what appeared to be 5 other SEALs pinned down behind inadequate cover. 2 were clearly unconscious, or worse, their bodies motionless despite the chaos around them. The Taliban fighters had chosen their ambush position well. They controlled the high ground on 3 sides of the ravine, creating a killing field that made any movement by the SEALs extremely dangerous. Their firing positions were well concealed among the rocks, making individual targets difficult to identify. But Evelyn's months of studying local terrain had taught her something the Taliban fighters probably didn't know. This particular ravine had been carved by seasonal flooding, which meant there was a drainage channel that ran along its eastern edge. The channel was invisible from most angles, but could provide concealed movement for someone who knew where to look. She keyed her radio to the artillery coordination frequency. Fire Direction Center, this is Forward Observer Jones. I need immediate fire mission. Grid reference 41 RQ1 45678 9012. Jones, this is FDC, came the surprise response. You're not certified as a forward observer, and we show you as assigned to base communications. FDC, I have eyes on 12 to 15 enemy fighters engaging friendly forces. I need high explosive rounds, proximity fused, targeting the northern ridgeline, danger close. Friendlies are 300 meters south of target area. There was a pause before the artillery coordinator responded. Jones' danger close artillery requires authorization from a qualified forward observer or field commander. We cannot process this request. Evelyn felt frustration building as she watched the SEAL's situation deteriorate. Bureaucracy was going to get good men killed while she had the knowledge and position to help them. FDC, this is Chief Petty Officer Chen, came a new voice on the radio. I'm authorizing Jones as our forward observer. We need that fire mission now. Roger, Chief. Jones, send your fire mission. Evelyn smiled grimly as she began calling in coordinates. Her obsessive study of artillery procedures, dismissed as irrelevant to her communications role, now became the key to saving lives. Fire mission Grid 41, RQ1 46089 150, enemy personnel in the open. High explosive, proximity fused. 3 rounds, fire for effect. Shot out, came the response from the Fire Direction Center. Shot out, Evelyn acknowledged, then keyed her signal to the SEALs. Chief Chen, artillery rounds inbound. 30 seconds. When they impact, I'm moving to your position via the drainage channel on your eastern flank. Negative base communications, Chen replied immediately. That approach is covered by enemy fire. You'll be walking into a kill zone. Chief, trust me on this one. I've studied this terrain for months. There's a concealed approach that the enemy can't observe from their current positions. The artillery rounds impacted with thunderous explosions that shook the ground and sent clouds of dust and debris into the air. Evelyn could see the muzzle flashes from the northern position cease momentarily as the Taliban fighters took cover from the bombardment. She used that moment of confusion to begin her descent into the ravine, following the drainage channel she had identified on topographical maps but had never actually seen. The route was treacherous. Loose rocks threatened to send her tumbling into the open, and thorny vegetation tore at her uniform, but it provided the concealment she needed. Halfway down the slope, she heard the crack of rifle fire and felt something tug at her sleeve. The Taliban fighters had spotted her movement and were trying to acquire her as a target. She low-crawled the remaining distance, using every piece of cover available. When she finally dropped into the ravine beside the SEAL's position, Chief Chen stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. I'll be damned, you actually made it. Chief, what's the status of your wounded? Evelyn asked, immediately shifting into medic mode as she assessed the 2 motionless SEALs. Petty Officer Rodriguez took an AK round to the chest, but his body armor absorbed most of the impact. He's unconscious but breathing. Petty Officer Thompson caught shrapnel from an RPG in his leg and abdomen. He's critical and needs immediate evacuation. Evelyn moved to Thompson first, her medical training taking over as she assessed his injuries. The shrapnel wounds were serious but manageable with proper first aid. The real problem was that both wounded men were dead weight, and the ravine's steep walls made carrying them nearly impossible under fire. Chief, I need to call in more artillery to suppress the enemy positions. Then we're going to move these men out of here, she said, applying pressure bandages to Thompson's wounds. Move them where? Chen asked. We're completely surrounded. Extraction is still 15 minutes out. Evelyn pointed toward the drainage channel she had used to reach them. That route leads to a natural defensive position about 500 meters south of here. Better cover, clear field of fire, and accessible to helicopter extraction. Chen shook his head. Even if that route is concealed, we can't carry 2 critical casualties up that slope under fire. We're not going up, Evelyn replied, finishing her work on Thompson's bandages. We're going through. She keyed her radio to the artillery frequency. FDC, this is Forward Observer Jones. I need continuous suppression fire on multiple targets. Stand by for coordinates. As she began calling in a complex fire mission designed to keep the Taliban fighters' heads down long enough to move the wounded SEALs, Evelyn realized that her emotional investment in these men's survival had led her to the most intense combat situation of her life. But instead of breaking down or becoming overwhelmed, she felt a strange sense of clarity. Everything she had studied, every skill she had developed, every moment of preparation had led to this point where her determination to save lives would be tested against the harsh realities of combat. The sustained artillery bombardment created a wall of explosions along the ridgelines, forcing the Taliban fighters to seek deeper cover and temporarily suppressing their ability to maintain accurate fire on the ravine. Evelyn used the brief respite to complete her medical assessment of both wounded SEALs. Thompson was stable but would need surgical intervention within the next few hours. Rodriguez was regaining consciousness, his body armor having saved his life, but he was still disoriented and unable to walk without assistance. Both men would have to be carried, and the route Evelyn had planned would challenge every member of the team. Chief, I need you and your men to lay down covering fire toward the northern positions while I move Thompson, she told Chen, shouldering her rifle and preparing to lift the wounded SEAL. You can't carry him alone, Chen protested. Thompson weighs 180 pounds plus gear. That's more than you weigh. Evelyn looked at the unconscious SEAL, then at Chen. Chief, I didn't come this far to leave anyone behind. She had trained for this scenario, though no one at the base knew it. During her off-duty hours, she had practiced carrying heavy loads over difficult terrain, pushing her body beyond what anyone thought possible for someone her size. Her emotional investment in being prepared for any situation had driven her to develop physical capabilities that exceeded official expectations. Using a fireman's carry technique she had perfected during countless training sessions, Evelyn lifted Thompson onto her shoulders. The weight was enormous, but her technique distributed it efficiently across her frame. More importantly, her absolute determination to save his life gave her strength that pure physical training couldn't provide. Moving now, she announced, beginning the treacherous journey through the drainage channel with Thompson's unconscious form balanced across her shoulders. The route was a nightmare of loose rock, thorny vegetation, and steep gradients that threatened to send both of them tumbling into the open. Every step had to be calculated, every handhold tested before committing her full weight, plus Thompson's, to the precarious footing. Behind her, she could hear Chen and his remaining SEALs maintaining suppressive fire against the Taliban positions, their M4 carbines providing the audio cover she needed to mask the sounds of her movement. The artillery strikes continued to impact around the enemy positions, creating confusion and preventing them from organizing an effective pursuit. Halfway through the movement, disaster struck. A loose rock gave way under her foot, sending her sliding sideways toward an exposed area where Taliban fighters would have a clear shot. With Thompson unconscious on her shoulders, she couldn't use her hands to arrest the fall. Instead, she used a technique she had learned during rock climbing training, shifting her weight and using her legs to redirect the slide toward a cluster of boulders that would provide cover. The maneuver worked, but the impact against the rock sent pain shooting through her ribs and left shoulder. She bit back a cry of pain and kept moving, knowing that stopping would mean death for both of them. When she finally reached the defensive position she had identified, Evelyn carefully lowered Thompson behind a natural rock wall that provided excellent cover and clear sight lines in multiple directions. The position was everything she had hoped for: defensible, accessible to helicopter extraction, and with multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated further. Chief Chen, I'm in position with Thompson, she radioed. The defensive position is secure. Bring Rodriguez and your team when you're ready. Outstanding work, Jones, Chen replied. We're beginning movement now. But as Chen and his team started their own movement through the drainage channel, the Taliban fighters began to adapt to the new tactical situation. The artillery bombardment had disrupted their initial assault, but they were now repositioning to maintain pressure on the Americans. Evelyn could see muzzle flashes from new positions as the enemy fighters attempted to cut off the SEALs' movement. The covering fire from Chen's team was becoming sporadic as they focused on their own movement, leaving gaps that the Taliban were quick to exploit. FDC, this is Forward Observer Jones, she called into her radio. I need immediate shift fire to new target areas. Enemy is repositioning to intercept friendly movement. As she began calling in new artillery coordinates, Evelyn realized that the enemy fighters had identified her position. Rounds began impacting around her defensive position, sending rock fragments flying and forcing her to keep her head down, while simultaneously treating Thompson's wounds and coordinating fire support. The next few minutes would test every skill she had developed, every moment of preparation she had invested, and every ounce of determination she could summon. The Taliban fighters were closing in, Chen's team was exposed during their movement, and the extraction helicopter was still 10 minutes away. But Evelyn had come too far to fail now. Her emotional investment in saving these men had brought her to this moment, and she was determined to see it through, regardless of the cost. She keyed her on radio one more time, her voice steady despite the rounds impacting around her position. All stations, this is Forward Observer Jones. We're bringing everyone home today. Just hold on a little longer. The Taliban fighters had regrouped faster than Evelyn anticipated. As Chen's team moved through the drainage channel with Rodriguez, enemy fire began to concentrate on their route, forcing the SEALs to take cover in positions that offered minimal protection. From her defensive position, Evelyn could see the tactical situation developing into a deadly stalemate. The SEALs were pinned down in the channel, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to concentrated fire. The extraction helicopter was still 8 minutes away, but at the current rate of ammunition expenditure, Chen's team would be out of rounds long before help arrived. "Chief Chen, what's your ammunition status?" she called over the radio. "We're down to 2 magazines per man," Chen replied, his voice tight with controlled stress. "Rodriguez is conscious but can barely walk. We need covering fire to complete the movement." Evelyn assessed her options. The artillery support was effective but couldn't provide the precise, sustained suppression needed to cover the SEALs' movement. The enemy fighters were too close to friendly forces for danger, close artillery strikes, and they were using cover that minimized the effectiveness of indirect fire. What the situation required was direct, accurate, small arms fire from a position that could suppress multiple enemy locations simultaneously. Evelyn looked at her own rifle, then at the terrain between her position and the Taliban fighters. She could provide the covering fire Chen needed, but it would mean exposing herself to return fire from at least 8 enemy positions. Given her size and the amount of open ground she'd have to cover, survival would depend entirely on speed, accuracy, and the element of surprise. "Chief, I'm going to provide covering fire for your movement," she announced, checking her weapon and ammunition supply. "Negative, Jones," Chen replied immediately. "You're already in a good defensive position. Don't expose yourself unnecessarily." "Chief, with respect, those fighters have you pinned down, and you're running out of ammunition. Someone has to take the initiative." Evelyn didn't wait for a response. She moved to the edge of her defensive position and began engaging the nearest Taliban fighter positions with carefully aimed single shots. Her marksmanship training, honed through hundreds of hours of practice that others had dismissed as excessive, now paid immediate dividends. Her first shot eliminated a fighter who had been directing fire at Chen's position. Her second took out a machine gunner who had been suppressing the drainage channel. Each shot was calculated, precise, designed to maximize tactical effect while conserving ammunition. The Taliban fighters quickly identified her as a threat and began concentrating their fire on her position. Rounds impacted around her, sending rock fragments flying and forcing her to constantly shift positions to avoid presenting a static target. But her covering fire had the desired effect. Chen's team was able to advance through the channel, carrying Rodriguez between them, while Evelyn's accurate shooting kept the enemy fighters focused on their own survival rather than offensive action. "Jones, we're moving," Chen called over the radio. "Keep that fire coming." Evelyn continued to engage targets, her emotional investment in the mission translating into a level of focused intensity that surprised even her. Every shot mattered, every target eliminated brought the SEALs closer to safety. Every second of suppression bought precious time for extraction. But the Taliban fighters were disciplined and experienced. They began coordinating their fire, forcing Evelyn to take cover while simultaneously trying to maintain suppressive fire. It was a deadly mathematics problem with no perfect solution. That's when the first round found her. The AK-47 bullet struck her left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her rifle clattering across the rocks. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, and the immediate shock made her vision blur momentarily. But even as pain flooded her system, Evelyn's mind remained focused on the mission. Chen's team was still 50 meters from her position, still vulnerable to enemy fire. Thompson was unconscious and depending on her medical care. The extraction helicopter was still 5 minutes away. She retrieved her rifle with her good arm and continued firing, using her right hand to maintain weapon control while her left arm hung useless at her side. The pain was incredible, but her emotional investment in saving these men overrode everything else. The second round hit her in the right thigh, nearly dropping her to the ground. The third caught her in the left side, just below her body armor. The fourth round grazed her head, sending blood streaming down her face and making her ears ring. But Evelyn Jones refused to fall. Her body was failing, but her determination remained absolute. As Chen's team finally reached her defensive position, carrying Rodriguez between them, she continued to provide covering fire despite her wounds. Jesus Christ, Jones, Chen exclaimed when he saw her condition. You've been hit multiple times. I'm fine, Evelyn replied, though blood was now pooling beneath her position. Get Thompson ready for extraction. Helicopter's 3 minutes out. She wasn't fine. She was bleeding from 4 separate wounds. Her vision was starting to tunnel from blood loss, and her left arm was completely useless. The graze to her head had left her dizzy and disoriented, but her training had taught her to compartmentalize pain and focus on the mission objectives. The extraction LZ is 200 meters south of here, Chen said, pointing toward a relatively flat area that would accommodate a helicopter landing. But we'll never make it carrying 2 wounded men while under fire. Evelyn looked at the extraction zone, then at the wounded SEALs. Thompson was still unconscious, and Rodriguez was barely able to stand, even with assistance. The Taliban fighters had repositioned again and were preparing for another assault on their defensive position. Chief, how much ammunition do you have left? She asked, reloading her own rifle with movements that were becoming increasingly clumsy as blood loss affected her coordination. Maybe 60 rounds total for the whole team, Chen replied grimly. Not enough for a sustained firefight. Evelyn keyed her radio with her good hand. FDC, this is Forward Observer Jones. I need immediate suppression fire. Walking barrage from Grid 41 RQ1 4608920 to Grid 41 RQ1 4808994. Duration 5 minutes. Continuous fire. Jones, that's a lot of ordnance, came the reply from the Fire Direction Center. Are you sure about those coordinates? FDC, I have multiple friendly wounded requiring extraction. I need that barrage to cover our movement to the LZ. Fire for effect. As the artillery began impacting in a steady rhythm designed to suppress enemy movement across a wide area, Evelyn struggled to her feet. The pain from her wounds was becoming overwhelming, but her emotional investment in saving these men provided strength that pure adrenaline couldn't match. Chief, we're moving now, she announced. I'll take Thompson. You get Rodriguez. Your men provide security. Chen looked at her incredulously. Jones, you can barely stand. You can't carry Thompson 200 meters. Watch me, Evelyn replied. Moving toward the unconscious SEAL, using her functioning right arm and compensating for her wounded left side, she managed to get Thompson into a modified fireman's carry. The position put enormous strain on her wounded shoulder, but she gritted her teeth and began moving toward the extraction zone. The journey across 200 meters of broken terrain while carrying an unconscious man and bleeding from multiple wounds was the most difficult physical challenge of Evelyn's life. Every step sent pain through her body, and her vision began to blur from blood loss. But her emotional connection to the mission, the same trait that had made others question her combat readiness, now provided the psychological strength to push through physical limitations that should have been insurmountable. Behind her, she could hear Chen's team moving with Rodriguez, their progress slow but steady. The artillery barrage was working, keeping the Taliban fighters suppressed and unable to mount an effective pursuit. Halfway to the extraction zone, Evelyn's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, still holding Thompson, her body finally beginning to shut down from shock and blood loss. Jones, Chen called out, seeing her fall. Keep moving, she replied, forcing herself back to her feet through pure determination. Don't stop for me. The sound of helicopter rotors began to fill the air as the extraction aircraft approached the landing zone. Evelyn could see the UH-60 Blackhawk in the distance, its crew chief already preparing for a hot extraction under fire. But the Taliban fighters had also heard the helicopter and were attempting to break through the artillery barrage to engage the aircraft. Muzzle flashes appeared from positions that the indirect fire hadn't been able to suppress, and Evelyn could see tracer rounds beginning to arc toward the approaching helicopter. Chief, the helicopter's taking fire, she called over the radio. They need immediate suppression on the northern ridgeline. Chen's team was focused on moving Rodriguez and couldn't provide effective covering fire. The helicopter crew was trained for hot extractions, but sustained, accurate fire could force them to abort the mission. Evelyn looked at Thompson, unconscious in her arms, then at the helicopter crew risking their lives to save them. Her emotional investment in bringing everyone home alive crystallized into one final surge of determination. She carefully lowered Thompson behind a rock outcropping, then raised her rifle and began engaging the Taliban positions that were firing at the helicopter. Her marksmanship, even with a wounded shoulder and failing vision, was still accurate enough to suppress the enemy fighters. Each shot sent agony through her wounded shoulder, and each muzzle flash revealed her position to return fire. But Evelyn continued shooting, providing the covering fire necessary for the helicopter to complete its approach. The Black Hawk touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, its crew chief jumping out to assist with loading the wounded. Evelyn maintained covering fire until the last possible moment, then collapsed as exhaustion and blood loss finally overwhelmed her system. The crew chief reached Evelyn just as she lost consciousness, her rifle still clutched in her right hand. Blood had soaked through her tactical vest and was pooling beneath her position, creating a crimson stain against the Afghan desert floor. "We've got multiple wounded," the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise to the flight medic. "This one's critical." Chief Chen appeared beside them, helping to lift Evelyn toward the helicopter, while his remaining SEALs provided security. "She carried Thompson 200 meters with 4 gunshot wounds," he told the flight medic. "She's been coordinating artillery and providing covering fire for the last half hour." The flight medic's eyes widened as he assessed Evelyn's injuries during the short sprint to the aircraft. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder, another to the right thigh, a third to the left side that had barely missed vital organs, and a graze to the head that had left her scalp split and bleeding. "How is she still conscious?" the medic asked, applying pressure bandages as they loaded her into the helicopter. "She's not anymore," Chen replied grimly, "but she stayed conscious long enough to get us all out." As the Black Hawk lifted off from the landing zone, taking fire from Taliban positions that had managed to reposition despite the artillery barrage, the flight medic worked frantically to stabilize all 3 wounded soldiers. Thompson was responding well to treatment. Rodriguez was conscious and stable, but Evelyn was rapidly going into shock from blood loss. "How far to the trauma center?" the medic called to the pilots. 12 minutes, came the reply. "We're pushing maximum speed." The medic looked at Evelyn's pale face and weak pulse. 12 minutes might be too long. She had lost a significant amount of blood, and her blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. But she was still fighting, her body refusing to quit, even in unconsciousness. Chief Chen knelt beside her stretcher, holding pressure on her side wound. "Come on, Jones," he said quietly. "You didn't carry us this far to give up now." During the flight, Chen began to piece together the full scope of what Evelyn had accomplished. She had left her assigned post without authorization, navigated 3 miles of hostile territory alone, coordinated complex artillery fire missions, provided medical treatment under fire, and carried 2 wounded SEALs to safety while absorbing 4 gunshot wounds herself. It was the kind of performance that military legends were built on, accomplished by someone who had been dismissed as too emotional for real combat operations. "Chief," Rodriguez said weakly from his stretcher. "Who is she? I've never seen anything like what she just did." Chen looked at Evelyn's unconscious form, her blood-stained uniform, and her small frame that had somehow carried men twice her size through hell. "She's the soldier they said was too soft for combat," he replied. "Turns out they were wrong about everything." The helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Wolverine's Trauma Center, where a full surgical team was waiting. As medical personnel rushed the wounded into the facility, word of Evelyn's actions began to spread throughout the base. Major Harrison, who had spent hours coordinating search and rescue operations, stood on the landing pad, watching as Evelyn was wheeled into surgery. His communications specialist, the woman he had assigned to equipment manifest because she was deemed too emotional for field operations, had just accomplished the most daring rescue mission in the base's operational history. "Sir," Sergeant Williams approached him with a radio handset. "Colonel Martinez from Regional Command is on the line. He wants a full debrief on the rescue operation." Harrison took the handset, his mind still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "Colonel, this is Major Harrison. The rescue operation was successful. All personnel extracted safely." "I understand one of your soldiers conducted an unauthorized solo rescue mission," the colonel replied. "What's the status of that individual?" Harrison looked toward the trauma center where Evelyn was fighting for her life. "Sir, Specialist Jones is currently in surgery. She sustained multiple gunshot wounds during the operation." "Jones? I don't see a Jones on your operational roster for today." "No, sir. She wasn't on the operational roster. She was assigned to base communications. She conducted the rescue mission without authorization." There was a long pause before the colonel responded. "Major, are you telling me that a communications specialist Single-handedly rescued two Navy SEALs from a Taliban ambush? Sir, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And she did it while coordinating artillery fire and treating wounded under enemy fire. Another pause. I'm going to need a very detailed report on this incident, Major. This kind of initiative is either going to result in a court-martial or a medal, possibly both. As Harrison ended the radio call, he realized that Evelyn's unauthorized rescue had created ripple effects that would extend far beyond their small forward operating base. Her actions would be analyzed, debated, and ultimately judged by people who hadn't been there, who hadn't heard the desperation in the SEAL's radio calls or witnessed the impossible determination that drove her to attempt what everyone else said couldn't be done. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was whether the woman who had proven that emotional investment could be the ultimate combat strength would survive long enough to face the consequences of her extraordinary courage. The surgery lasted hours. Evelyn's wounds, while not individually life-threatening, had combined to create massive blood loss and trauma that pushed her body to its absolute limits. The surgical team worked methodically to repair damaged tissue, remove bullet fragments, and stabilize her vital signs. Chief Chen waited in the medical facility's corridor throughout the entire procedure, refusing offers to rest or get his own minor injuries treated. Thompson and Rodriguez, both stable and recovering, had insisted on remaining at the hospital despite being cleared for transport to larger medical facilities. "You don't have to wait," the head nurse told Chen for the third time. "We'll notify you when she's out of surgery." "Ma'am, that woman saved my life and the lives of my men," Chen replied. "I'm not going anywhere until I know she's okay." Word of the rescue had spread throughout the military network with unprecedented speed. By evening, Evelyn's actions were being discussed in briefing rooms from Kabul to the Pentagon. A communications specialist who had been deemed too emotional for combat operations had accomplished what elite special operations units would have considered an ambitious mission. Major Harrison spent the day fielding calls from increasingly senior officers who wanted detailed explanations of how a soldier assigned to logistics support had ended up conducting unauthorized combat operations in hostile territory. Each conversation forced him to confront his own assumptions about Evelyn's capabilities and potential. "Sir," Sergeant Williams approached him in the command center, carrying a thick file folder. "I've been reviewing Specialist Jones's training records and performance evaluations." "What did you find?" Harrison asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Her marksmanship scores are in the top 5% of all personnel on this base. Her physical fitness scores exceed standards for combat infantry. Her knowledge of artillery procedures is better than most certified forward observers." Williams paused, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, we've been wasting her abilities." Harrison nodded grimly, "because we assumed that emotional responses indicated weakness rather than investment." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same emotional traits that had kept Evelyn away from combat operations had ultimately driven her to prepare more thoroughly, train more intensively, and commit more completely to mission success than soldiers who were considered more suitable for dangerous assignments. The surgeon finally emerged from the operating room. Chen immediately stood up, followed by Thompson and Rodriguez, who had been moved to wheelchairs but refused to leave the hospital. "How is she, Doc?" Chen asked. Dr. Sarah Kim pulled off her surgical cap, exhaustion evident in her face. "She's stable. We removed bullet fragments from her shoulder and thigh, repaired internal damage from the side wound, and addressed the head injury. She lost a lot of blood, but she's young and strong." "Will she make a full recovery?" Thompson asked from his wheelchair. "The shoulder wound will require extensive physical therapy, and she'll have some permanent scarring. But physically, yes, she should recover completely." Dr. Kim paused, studying the faces of the three SEALs. "What I don't understand is how she remained functional with those injuries. Most people would have gone into shock and collapsed." Chen smiled for the first time in hours. "Doc, you'd have to know her to understand. That woman doesn't quit when people are depending on her." When Evelyn finally regained consciousness, the first thing she saw was Chen sitting beside her hospital bed, reading a paperback novel. "Chief," she said weakly, her voice hoarse from the surgical intubation, "how are Thompson and Rodriguez?" Chen looked up from his book, amazed that her first conscious words were about the welfare of others. They're fine, Jones. Thompson's going to make a full recovery, and Rodriguez is already talking about getting back to operations. Good, Evelyn replied, closing her eyes briefly. That's good. Jones, Chen said quietly, do you understand what you accomplished out there? Evelyn considered the question, her mind still foggy from anesthesia and pain medication. I did what anyone would have done in that situation. No, Chen corrected her firmly. You did what no one else could have done. You navigated hostile territory alone, coordinated complex fire missions under pressure, carried wounded men twice your size through enemy fire, and stayed conscious long enough to provide covering fire while bleeding from 4 gunshot wounds. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Jones, I've served with elite special operations units for 15 years. What you did out there was extraordinary by any standard. Evelyn absorbed this information slowly, her emotional investment in the mission having been so complete that she hadn't fully considered the magnitude of her own actions. She had simply seen people who needed help and done whatever was necessary to provide it. Chief, she said finally, are Thompson and Rodriguez really okay? Chen laughed despite himself. Jones, you just performed one of the most remarkable rescue missions in military history, and you're still worried about whether everyone else is fine. That's what matters, Evelyn replied simply. Everything else is just details. As Chen sat beside her bed, he realized that Evelyn's emotional investment in others' welfare, the trait that had been dismissed as a weakness unsuitable for combat operations, was actually the source of strength that had enabled her extraordinary performance under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The military would spend months analyzing her actions, debating the implications of her unauthorized mission, and determining what her performance meant for combat assignments and gender roles in special operations. Chen already understood the most important lesson, that true combat strength wasn't about emotional detachment or physical dominance. It was about the absolute refusal to let others suffer when you had the power to help them, regardless of personal cost. The investigation into Evelyn's unauthorized rescue mission began days after her surgery. A board of senior officers arrived at Forward Operating Base Wolverine to conduct what they termed a comprehensive review of operational procedures and command decisions. Colonel Patricia Martinez, the investigating officer, was known throughout the military for her no-nonsense approach to discipline and her skepticism of soldiers who operated outside established protocols. Her first meeting with Major Harrison set the tone for what everyone expected would be a lengthy court-martial proceeding. Major Harrison, by her Colonel Martinez, began reviewing her file. Can you explain how a communications specialist assigned to base operations ended up conducting solo combat missions in hostile territory? Harrison had spent days preparing for this question, but the answer still felt inadequate. Colonel, Specialist Jones made an unauthorized decision to attempt a rescue when conventional resources were unavailable. Unauthorized is one way to put it, Martinez replied dryly. Insubordinate, reckless, and potentially catastrophic are others. What training did Jones receive for combat operations? Ma'am, she completed basic infantry training and additional courses during her off-duty time, but she was never assigned to combat roles. Martinez made notes on her legal pad, so she had no official authorization for the actions she took, no command oversight, and no backup support. Is that correct? That's correct, ma'am. And you see no problems with a soldier deciding independently which orders to follow and which to ignore. Harrison felt the weight of military discipline pressing down on the conversation, but he also remembered listening to the radio calls from dying SEALs while conventional rescue forces were hours away. Colonel, if I may, he said carefully, the results speak for themselves. 2 Navy SEALs are alive today because of Jones's actions. The results, Major, are irrelevant to the question of military discipline. Success doesn't justify insubordination, Martinez replied, closing her file. I'll be interviewing Jones tomorrow. I assume she's recovered enough to answer questions. The next morning, Evelyn sat in a wheelchair in the base conference room, her left arm in a sling and her wounds still visible beneath her hospital gown. Despite her injuries, she maintained perfect military posture as Colonel Martinez began her interrogation. Specialist Jones, do you understand why you're here? Yes, ma'am. I'm being investigated for conducting unauthorized operations. That's correct. Can you explain your decision to ignore Major Harrison's direct orders and leave your assigned post? Evelyn had rehearsed this answer during her recovery, knowing that her response would determine whether she faced a court-martial or continued her military career. Ma'am, I believe that American soldiers would die if I didn't act. I had the skills and knowledge necessary to help them, and I made the judgment that saving their lives justified the risk of disciplinary action. Martinez leaned forward. Specialist military discipline exists because individual soldiers cannot be allowed to make those kinds of judgments independently. If every soldier decided for themselves at which orders to follow, military units would cease to function. I understand that, ma'am, but I also understood that Chief Chen and his team would die if someone didn't reach them immediately. That wasn't your decision to make, Jones. You're a communications specialist, not a special operations soldier. Evelyn met Martinez's gaze directly. Ma'am, with respect, dying soldiers don't care about job classifications. They need help from whoever can provide it. The room fell silent. Martinez made notes, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of Evelyn's responses. Jones, are you aware that your actions could have resulted in additional casualties? That you could have been killed, requiring further rescue operations that would have endangered more personnel? Yes, ma'am. I calculated those risks before I acted. And you decided that your individual judgment was superior to that of your commanding officers. This was the crucial question, the one that would determine whether Evelyn's motivation was seen as heroic initiative or dangerous insubordination. Ma'am, I decided that I couldn't live with watching fellow soldiers die when I might be able to save them. The risk to myself seemed insignificant compared to that certainty. Martinez continued taking notes, then asked the question that surprised everyone in the room. Jones, Chief Chen submitted a written statement about your actions during the rescue operation. He states that you coordinated artillery fire with professional-level competence, provided medical treatment under combat conditions, and maintained tactical awareness throughout an extended firefight. Where did you acquire those skills? Ma'am, I studied artillery procedures, took advanced first aid courses, and practiced tactical movement during my off-duty time. Wow. The simple question cut to the heart of everything that had led to this moment. Evelyn's emotional investment in being prepared, her refusal to accept limitations, her determination to be ready for whatever her fellow soldiers might need. Because I wanted to be the best soldier I could be, ma'am. Because I believed that serving my country meant being ready for any situation where I could help. Martinez closed her files and looked directly at Evelyn. Jones, your actions were unauthorized, dangerous, and completely contrary to military protocol. Evelyn braced herself for the court-martial charges that would end her military career. However, Martinez continued, they were also extraordinarily courageous and ultimately successful in saving American lives. This board finds that while your methods were unacceptable, your results demonstrate capabilities that have been underutilized by this command. She paused, consulting her notes one final time. Specialist Jones, you're being transferred to Special Operations Command for advanced training. If you accept this assignment, you'll undergo the most intensive military instruction available, with the understanding that emotional strength can be just as valuable as physical strength in combat operations. The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Not punishment, but recognition. Not a court-martial, but promotion to the most elite units in the military. Ma'am, she said quietly, I accept. Months after the rescue mission, Evelyn stood in the briefing room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home to the Army's most elite special operations units. The patch on her shoulder now read Special Operations Command, and when she spoke during mission planning sessions, colonels and master sergeants listened with the respect reserved for proven combat veterans. The transformation hadn't been easy. The training program designed to prepare her for special operations was deliberately brutal, intended to break down preconceptions about what soldiers could accomplish and rebuild them with expanded capabilities. For someone who had already proven herself under the most extreme circumstances, it was validation rather than education. Martinez, her instructor, Master Sergeant Davis, had said during the training program, "You've got something most special operators take years to develop, the absolute refusal to quit when lives are on the line." The training covered advanced marksmanship, medical procedures, tactical communication, and combat leadership. But the most important lessons were psychological. Evelyn learned to trust her instincts, to make command decisions under pressure, and to understand that her emotional investment in mission success was an asset rather than a liability. Her fellow trainees, all experienced soldiers who had volunteered for special operations, initially viewed her with skepticism. A communications specialist who had been promoted to elite status through a single unauthorized mission seemed like an administrative error rather than a legitimate operator. That skepticism disappeared during a training exercise designed to test decision-making under extreme stress. When a simulated casualty evacuation went wrong and conventional protocols failed, Evelyn improvised a solution that saved the exercise and demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that special operations demanded. "How did you know that approach would work?" asked Captain Williams, one of her training partners, after the exercise concluded. "I didn't know," Evelyn replied honestly, "but I knew that accepting failure wasn't an option when someone needed help." The comment encapsulated everything that made her different from traditional special operations soldiers. Where others relied on extensive training and proven techniques, Evelyn's strength came from an emotional investment so complete that failure simply wasn't psychologically acceptable. News of her progress filtered back to Afghanistan, where Chief Chen was completing his own tour of duty. He had followed her career development with personal interest, knowing that her success validated not just her own capabilities, but the principle that combat effectiveness couldn't be measured through conventional metrics. "How's our rescue specialist doing?" Thompson asked during one of their conversations. He had made a complete recovery from his injuries and was preparing to return to operational status. "She's excelling," Chen replied. "Her instructors say she's developing into one of the most capable operators they've seen." "That doesn't surprise me," Rodriguez added. He had also recovered fully and had requested assignment to work with Evelyn when she completed her training. "What she did for us out there, that kind of determination doesn't come from training. That's just who she is." Meanwhile, at Forward Operating Base Wolverine, Evelyn's unauthorized rescue had created institutional changes that extended far beyond her individual case. Major Harrison had implemented new policies that encouraged soldiers to develop skills beyond their assigned specialties. Recognizing that modern combat required adaptability and initiative, the base's training programs now included cross-functional education, where communications specialists learned basic combat medicine, infantry soldiers studied artillery coordination, and support personnel practiced tactical movement. "What Jones proved," Harrison explained to visiting officers, "is that we were wasting human potential by assuming that job classifications determine capability. She showed us that emotional investment in mission success can drive soldiers to achieve things that seem impossible." Her story had also influenced military policy at higher levels. Pentagon analysts studying her rescue mission concluded that traditional gender restrictions in combat roles were based on outdated assumptions about physical requirements and emotional responses under stress. The analysis noted that Evelyn's relatively small physical stature had actually been advantageous during the rescue, allowing her to navigate terrain that would have been impassable for larger soldiers. More importantly, her emotional responses to crisis situations had enhanced rather than degraded her performance, driving her to prepare more thoroughly and fight more tenaciously than soldiers who relied on emotional detachment. As she progressed through special operations training, Evelyn received regular updates about policy changes that her actions had influenced. Women were being assigned to previously restricted combat roles. Training programs were emphasizing psychological resilience alongside physical strength, and military leaders were reconsidering the relationship between emotional investment and combat effectiveness. But for Evelyn, the most meaningful validation came from simpler sources: letters from Thompson and Rodriguez, updates from Chief Chen about successful missions, and reports from other soldiers who had been inspired to push beyond their assigned limitations. Her emotional investment in others' welfare, the trait that had once been seen as unsuitable for combat operations, had become the foundation of a military career that was redefining what it meant to be an elite soldier. The transformation was complete, but the mission was just beginning. A year after her unauthorized rescue mission, Evelyn received her first assignment as a fully qualified special operations soldier. The mission briefing took place in a secure facility where the walls were covered with maps of regions where conventional military operations had failed, and elite units were considered the only viable option. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, her new commanding officer, was a legend in special operations circles. She had commanded successful missions in 3 different theaters of operation and was known for her ability to identify soldiers who could perform beyond established expectations. Jones, Mitchell began reviewing the mission file. You're being assigned as team leader for Operation Desert Shield. Your mission is to extract a captured intelligence officer from a Taliban compound in Helmand Province. Evelyn studied the tactical maps, noting the compound's location in mountainous terrain that would make a conventional assault extremely difficult. The intelligence officer had been missing for days, and traditional rescue operations had been deemed too risky due to the isolated location and heavy enemy presence. Ma'am, what's the timeline for the operation? Evelyn asked. 48 hours, Mitchell replied. Intelligence suggests the prisoner will be moved to a more secure location after that, making rescue nearly impossible. It was exactly the kind of mission that had once been considered beyond Evelyn's capabilities. High risk, time-sensitive, requiring leadership of experienced special operations soldiers in hostile territory. Now it was simply another assignment for someone whose emotional investment in saving others had been recognized as a strategic asset. Team composition? Evelyn asked, reviewing the personnel files Mitchell provided. You'll have 4 operators, including Rodriguez from your original rescue. He specifically requested assignment to your team. Evelyn smiled at that information. Rodriguez had become one of her strongest supporters, understanding better than most how her unique approach to combat operations could achieve results that conventional methods couldn't match. The mission planning session extended through the night as Evelyn developed an operational approach that balanced speed, stealth, and contingency planning. Her emotional investment in the captured intelligence officer's survival drove her to consider variables and develop backup plans that more detached commanders might have overlooked. The key vulnerability is the extraction route, she explained to her team during the final briefing. The compound is positioned to make helicopter extraction extremely difficult, but there's a valley approach that could work if we can neutralize the observation posts. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Same kind of terrain analysis that got us out of that mess a year ago. You've got an eye for finding routes that others miss. The mission launched in the early hours on a moonless night that provided maximum concealment for their approach. Flying an especially modified Black Hawk helicopter, Evelyn's team inserted 15 kilometers from the target compound and began a careful approach through terrain that challenged every skill they had developed. But this time, Evelyn wasn't operating alone or without authorization. She was leading a team of experienced special operations soldiers who trusted her judgment and understood that her emotional investment in mission success translated into operational advantages that couldn't be measured through conventional metrics. The compound assault went exactly as planned. Evelyn's team neutralized the perimeter guards silently, penetrated the facility using routes she had identified through careful study of satellite imagery, and located the captured intelligence officer within 30 minutes of beginning the operation. But the extraction phase revealed why this mission had been assigned to Evelyn specifically. The intelligence officer, Captain David Park, had been severely beaten and was unable to walk without assistance. Conventional extraction would require carrying him across 15 kilometers of mountainous terrain while potentially under pursuit. Ma'am, Rodriguez said quietly, this is going to be just like before. We're going to have to carry him out. Evelyn looked at Park, unconscious and weighing at least 40 pounds more than Thompson had during her unauthorized rescue. The terrain was more challenging, the distance was greater, and artillery support wasn't available. Then that's what we'll do, she replied simply. We didn't come this far to leave him behind. Using the same techniques she had developed during her rescue of the SEALs, Evelyn organized her team for a carry rotation that would allow them to transport Park while maintaining security and navigation capability. Her emotional investment in his survival provided the psychological strength to attempt what others would have considered impossible. The 15-kilometer extraction took 8 hours of careful movement through enemy territory, with Evelyn personally carrying the Park for more than half the distance. Her training had improved her physical capabilities, but more importantly, it had reinforced her understanding that emotional investment could overcome physical limitations. When the extraction helicopter finally lifted off with Park safely aboard, Evelyn realized that her transformation from overlooked communications specialist to elite special operations leader was complete. But more than that, she had proven that the military's understanding of combat effectiveness needed to evolve beyond traditional assumptions about strength, training, in emotional responses. Her success wasn't just personal vindication, it was institutional change that would influence how the military identified, trained, and deployed soldiers for the most demanding missions. The girl they had called too emotional had become the operator they called when conventional approaches weren't enough. Years after that sunny day in Afghanistan, when 4 bullets failed to stop her from carrying 2 SEALs to safety, Colonel Evelyn Jones stood before a joint session of military leadership at the Pentagon. The oak leaves on her collar represented a journey from overlooked communications specialist to one of the most respected special operations commanders in the U.S. military. The briefing room was filled with generals, admirals, and senior civilian officials who had gathered to hear her presentation on emotional investment as a combat multiplier, a doctrine that had emerged from analysis of her unconventional approach to military operations. Traditional military training emphasizes emotional detachment as a requirement for combat effectiveness. Evelyn began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from proving theories through repeated success. However, our operational experience suggests that emotional investment, when properly channeled, can drive soldiers to achieve results that detached professionalism cannot match. The presentation detailed dozens of missions where soldiers who were emotionally invested in outcomes had exceeded conventional expectations, often accomplishing objectives that traditional approaches had deemed impossible. Evelyn's unauthorized rescue had been the catalyst, but the principle had been validated through years of subsequent operations. General Patricia Hayes, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, leaned forward with interest. Colonel Jones, are you suggesting that we modify our training philosophy to encourage emotional attachment rather than professional detachment? Ma'am, I'm suggesting that we recognize emotional investment as a legitimate source of combat strength, rather than treating it as a weakness to be overcome, Evelyn replied. Soldiers who care deeply about mission success and the welfare of their teammates often find reserves of strength and creativity that purely professional motivation cannot access. The doctrine she presented had emerged from careful analysis of not just her own experiences, but hundreds of cases where soldiers had performed beyond established capabilities when emotionally invested in outcomes. The military was beginning to understand that the traits traditionally associated with effective combat performance might be less important than the psychological commitment to refuse failure when lives were at stake. After the briefing, Evelyn walked through the Pentagon corridors where her portrait now hung among other military heroes. The photograph showed her in Afghanistan, blood-stained and wounded, but still carrying an unconscious SEAL toward extraction. The caption read, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." Her phone buzzed with a text message from Chief Chen, now a Master Chief Petty Officer serving as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Command. Saw your Pentagon presentation on the news. Thompson and Rodriguez want you to know they're still bragging about being carried to safety by someone half their size. Evelyn smiled at the message. Despite her promotion to senior leadership, the relationships forged during that desperate afternoon in the Afghan desert remained the most meaningful aspect of her military career. Those men were alive today because she had refused to accept that her emotional investment in their survival was a disqualifying weakness. Her current assignment involved developing training programs that identified and cultivated soldiers with similar psychological profiles. Individuals whose emotional investment in others could be channeled into exceptional combat performance. The military had finally recognized that the most effective warriors weren't necessarily those who felt the least, but those who felt the most and used that emotion as fuel for extraordinary achievement. The transformation was institutional as well as personal. Military occupational specialties were becoming more fluid, training programs emphasized adaptability over rigid specialization, and gender restrictions in combat roles had largely disappeared. Evelyn's example had demonstrated that artificial limitations based on physical characteristics or emotional responses could prevent the military from utilizing its human resources effectively. But the most important change was cultural. The military was learning to value soldiers who cared deeply about their missions and teammates, recognizing that emotional investment could drive preparation, performance, and perseverance beyond what professional obligation alone could achieve. As she prepared to leave the Pentagon that evening, Evelyn received one final message that captured the essence of her journey. It was from a young female soldier stationed in Afghanistan, where new challenges required the same kind of adaptive thinking and emotional commitment that had defined Evelyn's career. Ma'am, the message read, they told me I was too emotional for combat operations, but I've been studying your example, and I think they're wrong. When the mission matters enough, emotion becomes strength. Evelyn typed her reply carefully. Trust your instincts. Prepare thoroughly and never accept that caring too much is a weakness. The people who need your help don't care about conventional limitations. They just need someone who refuses to quit. She hit send and walked toward the Pentagon parking lot, where her car waited beneath the Virginia stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that emotional investment could overcome any obstacle, and new soldiers who needed to understand that their deepest feelings could become their greatest strengths. The girl they dismissed as too emotional had become the colonel they called when caring enough was the only thing that mattered. And in a world where conventional approaches often fell short, that made all the difference. Her story had started with 4 gunshots that should have ended everything. Instead, they had marked the beginning of a transformation that changed not just one soldier's career, but the entire military's understanding of what it meant to be strong enough to serve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any uploads from us.